3000 NFL Mock Draft.
3000 NFL Mock Draft.
With your friends Kenneth and Rob. Talking about the NFL and the draft and the Seahawks. 3000 NFL Mock Draft. 3000 NFL Mock Draft.
That's right. It is your friends, Kenneth and Rob, and this is 3000 NFL Mock Draft, the weekly NFL draft podcast. We're talking about the draft, mock drafts, the Seahawks draft, and all that kind of stuff, free agency, all the things that go into it. Right now it is March 22nd, 2016. And I guess that would make us a little bit more than 5 weeks shy of the 2016 NFL draft. The Seahawks picking 26th overall. Rumors, would they trade the first-round pick? At this point, they have not. No Joe Thomas. No any other player, I guess, that could be like Joe Thomas. It's just the Seahawks right now potentially going with Gary Gilliam at left tackle or Bradley Sowell. Could it really be? That seems to be the case after Russell Okung signs the worst deal perhaps in NFL history, especially for a player of his stature. I guess we really haven't talked about it. It happened after our last draft, after our last podcast. And I will note really quickly that this is our second attempt at recording 3000 NFL Mock Draft this week. Not that we want to air our technical follies, perhaps, but if you've listened to the show for the last 30 weeks, for about as long as we've been doing it, or 25 weeks, you know the technical follies are part of the game. You know, we're working our way there. Good point to interject and throw in an open parentheses and tell you that you can donate to the podcast through Patreon and help us out. And maybe in the future we will have someone like a producer or something that wants to help us figure this out so we can make calls and get some of these great guys like Rob Rang onto the show, who we just had to say sayonara to after our own technical mishaps and mistakes that ended that podcast after about 15 minutes. It just wasn't working. We're going to work on getting Rob Rang back in the future to do another podcast with us, because he was saying some really good stuff, and I'll try and echo what he was saying to an extent. And I don't want to parrot him and be a bad translator of what Rob Rang's opinions are, but little things, if things that he had said, just the small things about Gary Gilliam or LaRaven Clark or what have you. I want to thank Rob for his time today, and we're sorry that we couldn't get that worked out to the best of anyone's abilities. So I guess technically you could say it was the best to our abilities, which is just not up to standard or par. With all that being said, and I always sort of say a lot of things and then kick it over to Rob, as the fans over at SeahawksDraftBlog.com have noted several times that I am a bit of a mouthy host or co-host, you could say. But Rob, I always kick it over to you with a question, and then you have to interject and say, now, among those 5 minutes of word diarrhea, I wanted to tell you this. So I could let you say that. But we do have to talk about the Russell Okung contract. So say whatever it is that you wanted to say while I was talking endlessly, and then let's talk about Russell.
Well, I guess, first of all, thanks to Rob Rang, who gave us a great sort of 5-10 minutes. It's a shame that nobody's going to hear it, but I want to thank Rob. And if people want something to read tonight, on top of Seahawks Draft Blog and Field Goals, then certainly dig out a piece that Rob has done on CBS Sportline today, which is he's sort of polled a few NFL scouts and executives and has come up with a list of 10 really underrated prospects in terms of, guys the media are not covering. So I would highly recommend going and checking out that piece. It's very interesting. There's 1 or 2 guys on there that could definitely be possible Seahawk picks down the line. As for the Russell Okung contract, I think sort of the big lasting impression that I would have from this, Kenny, is that the fact that he's essentially signed a 1-year prove-it deal is neither here nor there for me, because he's got a very serious shoulder injury, which can be very serious for his position. If he was a running back or it wouldn't be quite as much of a problem, because so much is dependent on upper body. The fact that it's a very serious shoulder injury is going to concern a lot of teams. He was a good player. There's no way he should have been, lingering as long as he did in free agency. So that is an issue. So the prove-it deal is not the problem. The problem for me is that he has given all of the power to the Denver Broncos. So if he does well and performs this year and plays 16 games of high-level left tackle performance, then the Broncos are going to get him for a pretty decent price for the next sort of few years. They're probably going to get the going rate for a decent left tackle. If he just signed a 1-year prove-it deal and that was it, with no team option to follow, if he just signed a 1-year, $5 million contract, then in a year's time he could re-enter the market and really max out his potential. All he has done is given the Denver Broncos all of the power, because if they don't want to keep him next year, then he's a free agent. If they do want to keep him, they're going to keep him on their terms.
But you also had read that they could cut him right now and not pay him anything. Unless news has come out since the last news that I'd read on Pro Football Talk, he gets a $1 million workout bonus over the summer, and then a $2 million like roster bonus, and then like a $3 million base salary. But they could cut him now and pay him nothing. They could see the workout, pay him $1 million. They could let him get all the way up until the preseason, pay him $3 million. And I mean, at any point he could get cut. So it's like, if that's the same contract, if those numbers reported by Mike Florio are still accurate today, he didn't just give up the next 4 years. If he goes out and has a great season, he may not even get a prove it deal. He may have even cost himself the opportunity to prove it. It seems at some point you would think the players union or someone would step in and say, no, we can't allow a guy to sign this deal. He's not even getting it seriously looks like one of the worst contracts in NFL history, which says a lot about his agent.
Well, it does. And it says a lot about the process that he's gone through. I mean, it's been a shambles. I mean, let's just say what it is. I mean, he made a classic mistake of his market was cold to begin with. Let's go even further back than that. He sent a letter to all of the or an email to all of the clubs in the league, which he wasn't allowed to do, because if any of them had answered to him, that would have been tampering. So that's the first mistake. The second mistake, the free agency market opens, and the teams can't talk to each other and agree not to speak to Russell Okung because they'd all get into trouble. But what they can do is sort of think, this guy wants to get rid of agents. We don't want to do that. It's not in our best interest. So as a collective group, they don't have to speak to each other. They can kind of just sort of nod and wink and not agree to speak to him. So after sort of 2 or 3 days of nothing happening, he then goes on this, tour of the United States, going and meeting teams like the Pittsburgh Steelers, who had no cap room and ended up signing Ryan Harris for $3.9 million. He goes and sees the New York Giants, who've just spent a vast amount of money on their defensive line. And then having made all these visits, and there was nothing. And then all of a sudden, the Denver Broncos just appear from nowhere and offer him this pathetic contract. And it seems like he was more interested in coming out with a headline, which was, this is the average, total per year, and than actually securing a good deal after all of the issues, just to prove a point. And yeah, Russell, you're right. You may well average $10 to $12 million over the course of this contract. But that's dependent on you pretty much playing every game next year at a high level. The Denver Broncos then taking that option up. And then even then, if you do really well this year, you could probably re-enter the market next year and get even more than $10 to $12 million a year. So it's a hopeless deal. He's ceded all power to the Denver Broncos. And I kind of feel sorry for him because, Russell Okung's a good guy. He's trying to do something innovative, and it's backfired.
And the agent fee is like 3%. Agents don't take a ton of money. I mean, in Hollywood, I can tell you that agents take, 10, 15%, something like that, 10%. But in the NFL, it's 3%. I mean, there's a reason. I mean, they go out and, these guys like Drew Rosenhaus or whatever, yeah, they're rich because they have a lot of the biggest name clients. But, most agents aren't going out there just crushing out there. They're not making millions of dollars per year. You only get 3%. So if Russell Okung had signed, say, a $10 million per year deal, and I'm really setting myself up for failure, $300,000, I suppose, would be 3% of that. So, that $300,000, that's a big chunk of change, but he's left way more than that on the table. I mean, he could have easily gone out there. I mean, whatever it is, just like an Andre Smith goes out there and he signs a 1-year deal, and if he goes out and he performs and he proves himself to be, if he has a great season, then yeah, he can go out and sign a new contract. Now, will that contract be bigger than the Okung's option? he doesn't give himself any choice to actually test the market. This was his one chance to probably in his career to be a free agent, and he blew it. And yeah, I think people should feel bad for him. I don't think that he's a bad guy by no means. We have no reason to think he's anything other than a good guy that had good intentions, but clearly did not have enough good people around him telling him what the right thing to do was. It doesn't seem like the cost of an agent or whatever. These guys exist for a reason. They're good at what they do for a reason. I don't know if I can't even imagine that he got burned, in the past. It just seems like so unfair for a guy like that, a good guy, a guy that Seahawks fans should, I've given him a hard time because of the fact that he's never been able to be healthy for a full season. That's not necessarily, his fault. It's just we have nothing to hold against Russell Okung. I've got to feel bad, but at the same time, it is time to move on. When we did have Rob Rang on momentarily, we talked briefly about the possibilities of Jamarcus Webb at right tackle and Gary Gilliam at left tackle. And, Rob Rang mentioned how Gary Gilliam, we've just never seen him play left tackle. There's potential there, of course. And, we never really know because there isn't a lot of tape or history on Gary Gilliam, even as a standard offensive tackle, of course, playing tight end for, a lot of his college career. And I would think you could argue that Gary Gilliam was the best offensive lineman on the team last season. Now, whether or not that means that he's a great offensive lineman or a good one, and especially taking it even further and say, can he play left tackle, the most important position on the offensive line? We don't know that yet. It seems like that's the job that he's going to be fighting for. John Schneider saying that if it was today, Sowell and Gary Gilliam would be battling for the left tackle's position. Rob, Gary Gilliam's play with Seattle over the last year. You've been watching him. You've got, your chances to, you've said on Seahawks Draft Blog before that, this is something where we don't know if Gary Gilliam could actually turn into a great, one of the better left tackles in the game. Where would you sort of lean towards as far as Gary's ability to play left tackle? And do you think that it is actually possible that Sowell, after not really playing at all the last 2 years and being terrible the year before, could be the Seahawks opening day left tackle?
No, I don't think that's likely at all. I mean, I've got a million thoughts sort of on this whole topic. I mean, first of all, I think that it's pretty interesting that the Seahawks, they didn't come back to Russell Okung. I mean, they could have had the deal that Denver did. And I think it's pretty clear that there's two things there. One, they were ready to move on. And two, they did not want to have a player. I think this is something that, has been talked about on sort of sports radio recently, is they didn't want to have a player who was unhappy with his contract, kind of another one stuck in that locker room. So do you really want Russell Okung joining Michael Bennett and Cam Chancellor in 6 months thinking, do you know what? My contract's pretty awful. And I don't think they had any interest in that. So they're just willing to move on. Now, we've talked for a long time now about, and this is the sort of the main thought that I had with it, is that you had Danny O'Neill on Reeling the Field Goals with Danny Kelly, and you had him on your podcast, and he talked.
Yeah, that was a Danny episode. We tried a Rob episode today, but we'll figure it out.
Well, Danny, he mentioned that Gary Gilliam in that podcast would potentially, that they liked him as a left tackle. So this is, Danny kind of gave us that information months ago. And it's not a surprise at all that they've kind of planned for this. How I would describe this is if Gary Gilliam was in this current draft and you were looking at a guy with his height, his weight, his length, his athleticism, and his stat line, which would have put him among, easily amongst the top 5 athletic offensive tackles in this draft, then people would have said, yeah, I'd happily take this guy to be a left tackle. The only reason that people are skeptical, Kenny, is because there's this sort of reputation feeling amongst guys. So Gary Gilliam is an undrafted free agent. People ultimately have a negative feeling about him just because of that. And it's ridiculous. And it's in the same way that, a lot of people want the Seahawks to trade for Joe Thomas because they think, Joe Thomas, a name that I know that he's a brilliant left tackle. Get him in there because he will clearly be brilliant for the Seahawks. It's reassuring because he's a name, and it's not reassuring on Gary Gilliam because he's not a big name. Now, it doesn't matter that he's an undrafted free agent. Alex Boone was an undrafted free agent. He's just gone to Minnesota. A lot of people wanted to sign him in free agency. Jason Peters was an undrafted free agent and has been one of the best left tackles in the league for the last decade. So, you can you can look at what they want to do. His skill set is perfectly matched for left tackle. And my personal opinion on how he played in his first year as a starter, let's not forget that, is that he handles the speed rush very well. Tom Cable said, just to remind you on this, that Tom Cable said that there's only one player in the league who can beat Gary Gilliam with a speed rush. It's probably Von Miller. So Tom Cable thinks he can beat any other speed rusher in the league, which is telling. The one area that he is not particularly good at, and Rob Rang touched on this when we spoke to him, is that you can get into his chest, you can drive him back, you can bull rush him into the backfield. That's just a case of experience and technique and strength. Another year in the strength and conditioning program, another year of technique work, and he is going to be better prepared than ever. And he wasn't, tagged as a starter for last season. He came in when Justin Britt struggled at right tackle, and Alvin Bailey couldn't hold down the left guard spot. He kind of was thrown in there in pre-season as a starter. So when he's now going to be considered a left tackle, they can prepare him for that role specifically. I think he's going to do a great job there. And Gary Gilliam is probably going to be the left tackle in this team next year, and probably for the next few years as well. The big question for me is what you do with the rest of the offensive line, because it's not looking good. They avoided making veteran additions, which I'm not surprised about. They trust Tom Cable to make a silk purse out of a Sozier. They're going to do it again. And they're going to draft a few guys. They're going to put them in there. They're going to have a big competition. And that's just the way that this team is built. And I've got to say, I'm not particularly concerned.
I mean, it's interesting. It's when you look at the offensive line and you look at the Seahawks offensive line and their philosophy towards the offensive line, you can definitely look back and say they're not successful. They're not that successful with the way they build the offensive line. That being said, I mean, I think that they could have been on a path. If you look at the last 8 games in playoffs, for the most part, not counting the first half of the Panthers game, but if you look at what the Seahawks were able to do with that offensive line, giving Russell Wilson time, having Russell Wilson trust his offensive line. Now that's the other thing too. No matter what 5 guys they put out there, if Russell Wilson can trust his receivers and trust the offensive line, and sit in the pocket long enough, we've seen that he can be the best quarterback, nay, the best player in the NFL. So if the philosophy and if the trust from Russell Wilson, if all that stuff stays the same, then the offensive line can be just as successful as it was last year. I don't think losing J.R. Sweezy matters. It's not. You can go a lot worse, but I don't think that it's going to play a big part in the difference with this offense. Not with Mark Lewinsky. Not with the way that he was out there for one game. Not with the way the coaches have talked about him. You don't see them talking up every single player on that team. We have never seen, you don't really see Pete Carroll talk up the guys that he doesn't believe in. You see him talk up the guys that he does believe in, and I can't tell you how many times he's been wrong. I can't think of very many. Once he actually, he can have a positive outlook in free agency after just signing a guy. You can have a positive outlook after the draft, after just taking a guy. But when Pete Carroll has had time, he knows when he sees those guys in practice, and if Tom Cable sees the guys in practice, if he's praising them at that point, and he does that with a guy like Mark Lewinsky, and you don't do it with a guy like Terry Poole, then you sort of start to get the idea that there is a difference between these guys. So I think when you look overall with the way that Gary Gilliam and Mark Lewinsky and, trying to figure out everything and all the way the parts come together, there aren't as many reasons to really be concerned, because it's like saying this thing, the Seahawks, the most successful team in the NFL since 2012, aren't improving in this area that they've never been good at. Okay, well, tell me that they're going to get worse in something that they have been good at, not that they're going to stay the same in something they haven't. If they're not going to get worse in something they do well, and if they're not going to get better in something they do poorly, then we're still going to be able to expect 12 wins, right? And a real chance at the Super Bowl. So I don't think that it is a concern. That being said, of course, they're going to address the offensive line in the draft. And I think that it probably will come in the first and the second round. And today on SeahawksDraftBlog.com, Rob, you posted a 7-round mock of the Seahawks, giving 2 options for the first and the second round. So we can, that there's going to be a couple ways that the Seahawks could go. Well, the offensive line, defensive line, and you gave 2 different scenarios And in one of them, we're back again with Germain Ifedi. And in another one, we are taking Jonathan Bullard out of Florida. And we can talk separately or whatever. And I'm more probably interested in your second round offensive lineman that you talked about. But I am kind of curious with the way that you talk about Germain Ifedi and his size and ranked number 1 by SLA and in the 97th percentile. Do you think that Germain Ifedi can be as good as Laramie Tunsil?
No. I mean,
in a perfect world. I mean, obviously there is, but if he hits the ceiling, and we're not talking about Larry Tunsil is, a Robert Gallery. We're not talking about a failure. He's not a Jason Smith. But, how good can Germain Ifedi really be?
Well, he has everything to be, if you were going to design an offensive tackle and you could just sort of pick, how long you want them to be, how tall, how big, how athletic, then the guy would look like Germain Ifedi. And if people are not sort of convinced on his athleticism, jumping a 32.5-inch vertical at 324 pounds is not easy. That's one thing. And I would go on to the NFL.com website and search Germain Ifedi and find his combine. There's a video of his combine workout on there, and pause it before he begins the 40-yard dash, because the guy just looks like the Hulk. I mean, he is enormous. I mean, this guy is just incredible physically. So he's not as natural. The thing about Tunsil is he moves like a tight end. I mean, his combine workout was just gobsmacking, the way that he moved around, the change of direction, the hips. He was almost like a defensive back in his back pedal and his turn and his adjustment. So, Tunsil just looked great, but Ifedi looked really good as well. And I see a lot of criticism about Germain Ifedi, and this is something we have to remember with the Seahawks, is that Pete Carroll and John Schneider both feel the same way. They ask themselves, what can a player be for them? They don't spend a lot of time saying what they're not going to be. So they spend a lot of time on sort of the upside of a player and how they fit into the role that the Seahawks want them to be, and how can they develop some of the talents and the qualities that they've got. And it's one of the reasons why they generally go for athletic guys, because they can sort of see people they can work with and mold, and they love to coach these guys up. And when you look at Germain Ifedi, I mean, if you've got pretty much the perfect body of a defensive tackle and his technique isn't very good, well, then you work on the technique. You've still got a guy who could be one of the best defensive linemen in the league at the end of that, if he can get the technique right. And with Jamarcus Webb coming in to potentially play right tackle, this for me is a perfect situation to draft Germain Ifedi, because you can put him at left guard. I don't know if you spend much time on the mock draftable comparison website, Kenny, but one of the best comparisons according to that for Ifedi is Kalichi Osemele, who's just gone to the Oakland Raiders for something like $10 to $12 million a year. So if you can get Ifedi for $1.5 million a year on a rookie contract, then that makes a great deal of sense. And for the people who are complaining at the moment and saying there's not enough investment in the offensive line, you put a younger, cheaper version of Osemele on that offensive line at left guard, and you're going to see a major upgrade there. So I think that Ifedi is a very good option for them. And the other thing that he's got is that he can compete with Jamarcus Webb. And you can sort of work out who's going to be the left guard, who's going to be the right tackle in camp. And you may even improve 2 positions by adding that competition in someone like Ifedi. So I think he's a great option for the Seahawks. But I'm not fully prepared to say that it's the only direction they can go in. There are some nice interior line options in the middle rounds. So if they want to take a defensive player in the first round, they could. But I still think it's perhaps working towards its being an offensive lineman at 26.
This is 3,000 NFL mock draft. It is about mock drafts and the NFL in general. I do want to gift. I had a thing just pop in my head, and I just got to. It's a little off topic. It's a little off tangent, but I got to know. With most of the mock drafts right now, it seems, and not all of them. Some of them are. I know Chris Collinsworth just put out his first ever mock draft. And he didn't do this, but I see a lot of people putting Carson Wentz going second overall after Laramie Tunsil. And I think a lot of that has to do with people, they don't like to predict trades. But Rob, is there any way that Carson Wentz goes second overall if a quarterback doesn't go first overall? In the history of the NFL, 7 quarterbacks have gone second overall since 1970, I should say. 7 quarterbacks have gone second overall. 6 of those went after a quarterback. Only one, Burt Jones in 1973, ended up going after someone that wasn't a quarterback. Teams don't generally take, if there's a quarterback that can go 2, someone better just jump up and take him at 1. So the Cleveland Browns may even need to trade up if Carson Wentz is their guy or whoever their guy is. The Browns may need to trade up 1 spot. But Rob, do you see any way that Carson Wentz or someone, a quarterback goes first in this draft, would you say?
It's very possible. And I think that one of the things that's been a big hint towards that is the Cleveland Browns at least entertaining the prospect of trading for Colin Kaepernick and then speaking to Robert Griffin III. There's almost a feeling of maybe a contingency plan being formed here. Get a guy so that if the worst case happens and someone trades above them and they don't get the number 1 quarterback, then they have at least a fallback option there and they can take one of the other guys, whether it's Jalen Ramsey, Laramie Tunsil, Miles Jack, or Joey Bosa. So, there seems to be a plan in place where Cleveland can put this contingency together. And you're right. I mean, the Tennessee Titans surely are not married to the idea of taking Laramie Tunsil. They already have a left tackle in Taylor Lewan. If they can get a decent price, then, why wouldn't they move down a few picks? They could still get, Tunsil down the line. Or I think if they could stay in the top 10 and just move down, then that would be a pretty good thing. I think it's going to be a little bit expensive for someone like Los Angeles to get up to number 1 because it's such a big jump, and they would have to kind of spend like a Robert Griffin III type amount to get there. But it's interesting, and there are 1 or 2 teams that might be able to do it. So, could San Francisco move up to number 1, potentially to take a quarterback? Could Chicago maybe? That might be the one issue there, is that maybe there aren't the teams that that you would imagine that would go up and do it. And now that Philadelphia have kind of have sorted their need, maybe they are not going to look at a quarterback now. So I don't know. It's hard to work it out, but maybe Tennessee's going to be stuck there because if as good a point as you make, Kenny, just kind of actually while I looked at the list of the teams that might be able to move up and do it, there are not many in the top 10 who might sort of feel obliged to go up and get a quarterback.
Yeah, Collinsworth, as I mentioned, had the LA Rams trading up from 15 all the way to number 1. Now the Titans, to move down 14 spots, it would be quite the change. And I mean, you'd have to get another one of these ridiculous bounties. And I don't know if there's a quarterback that necessarily fulfills that requirement, that you would be that crazy. I don't think that Collinsworth really, I don't know if that one didn't seem to pass the vetting process of a trade that is going to happen. But, anything could happen. It is just interesting. And definitely the Rams need a quarterback. And that brings up just one more point, I guess, is that it really seems like over the course of this podcast, we've seen the great rise and fall of Paxton Lynch. At one point being the number 1 guy on our board to now seemingly back to being the number 3 quarterback. And I've seen him, fall as far as maybe to the Denver Broncos at 31. How far do you think Paxton Lynch does fall? Is there any way he gets past the Rams if they're there at 15?
No, I don't think that's very likely at all. And I'm constantly amazed by the trends in sort of these mock drafts. So, Paxton Lynch all of a sudden is now a 2nd round pick, and I don't get the hype with Jared Goff. I mean, I think he throws a very nice pass. I mean, I saw a lot of his pro day stuff. He was throwing the ball very well, but there were some reports that he didn't really impress in team meetings. And having watched him with John Gruden and with Steve Mariucci, I can kind of understand why. He just does not get. He's almost got a kind of a Jay Cutler personality vibe going there. And Paxton Lynch and Carson Wentz are much more engaging and interesting. And I just think that the skill set with those 2 guys is still going to be very attractive. So I think that people are going to be surprised how early Paxton Lynch goes. I think that maybe the momentum seems to be all with Carson Wentz right now. So I think that there's probably a very good chance that he's going to go 2nd overall at the latest. But Paxton Lynch I still think he could go in the top 10. In my mock draft that I did the other day, I had the Rams trading up to number 10 and swapping picks with the New York Giants. And I did that just because I think there may well come a point in sort of that top 10 range where a team feels like, okay, now's the time to just go up and get our guy. And the Rams need a quarterback. I could see Lynch working with Jeff Fisher in that system, and he's a good, talented quarterback. And I think that that kind of a move would make sense. And I think if he does get into sort of the beyond the 10th pick, teams like Chicago, who are maybe not married to the idea of Jay Cutler, might start to have a think about taking him, or there might even be teams sort of moving up from the 20s to get a look at him. So I think he's still going to go pretty early.
Moving back to your 7-round Seahawks mock draft, and when we have the Bullard going in the first round, you talk about Connor McGovern going in the second round, the left tackle out of Missouri. Sort of like in baseball, I don't know if you're familiar, Rob, with this sort of pitch, but in baseball's pitch, your best athlete plays shortstop. That's where they typically put the best guy, and then when they move up to the majors, he's probably maybe a third baseman, or a second baseman, or maybe even a first baseman or an outfielder. But your best athlete in high school and college and the minor leagues gravitates towards shortstop. And in college football, your best offensive lineman is going to sit over there at the left tackle spot unless he's, just a natural born center, and then he's going to stay at the center. But you've got Connor McGovern as a guy that when he moves over to the next level could be a great center, could be a great guard, but mostly sticking to that interior lineman and maybe a tackle in the reserve sort of section, or in the best case scenario. So in your mind, when you've got Bullard and McGovern, and you've got Ifedi, and your second round pick was Bronson Kaufusi, defensive end out of BYU. Which of those combinations did you like the best?
Good try on the name, by the way, and don't look at me for any help there. I just have to. That's one of the great things about writing a blog. You don't have to actually say the name. You just got to write it out. But look, when I was writing it out, I do think that the Seahawks are probably going to take an offensive lineman and then a defensive lineman. But the only problem is that it's hard to pair a pass rusher with the Seahawks in round 2, because I just think that some of the better options are going to be gone. And the thing about Kaufusi is how I've been naming him, is that he is very, very athletic, very, very big. He's got a good attitude, coach's son, and he's had production. So he had 11 sacks last year, and he's capable of playing inside and out. And I think that's the type of player that they're generally going to look for here. So if they wanted to take a high upside guy with production, which is generally what they've looked for in the early rounds, then he's an option. I mean, he again didn't run the most blistering 40 time, but it's deceptive. Don't just focus on the 40 times and the 10-yard split's important. His wasn't too bad at his size, but the short shuttle is very impressive for agility, and he ran a 4.25 short shuttle, which is kind of Joey Bosa range. Joey Bosa's was elite, so that's maybe one of the reasons why the Seahawks might look at him. Just to quickly go back to Jonathan Bullard, he is for me a very good option for the Seahawks, because he's got that sort of gritty, pissed off for greatness type of attitude. He's a little bit more limited than some people will have you believe, but he can play end and then he can kick inside. I think that's the kind of guy they're going to look for. And if they want to get an impact defensive lineman, then he may be one of the few that have got the level of athleticism and production that the Seahawks like. So he could be an impact defensive lineman, and then you focus on the interior offensive line in the middle rounds. But if you do that, then some of the options are maybe not going to be that great for the interior. So it's kind of a catch-22. If you wait on the offensive lineman, some of the better options might not be there. If you wait on a pass rusher, some of the better options might not be there. And that's one of the reasons why I thought they might trade the second pick, 56, for a pass rusher. So guarantee you've got, a veteran quality pass rusher in the team, a bit like with Arizona doing it with Chandler Jones. Guarantee that with your second pick, take the first pick for the offensive lineman. I still think there's maybe a chance that they will do that. It's still hard to look beyond the offensive lineman in the first round. Connor McGovern I really like. I just think that he could be the kind of guy that they feel like they can't leave the draft without. So flexible and versatile, could play a number of positions, very athletic, very strong. Seems like a Tom Cable type of offensive lineman. So having gone around the houses a little bit, to answer your question as to which I would prefer, I still think I'd like to see the investment in the offensive line, just because that was a real need area last season. They have still got Michael Bennett, Cliff Avell, Frank Clark on the defensive line. They don't have anywhere near as much talent on the offensive line. Maybe they need to make a commitment at that and just see what is available in round 2.
Well, for a team that has been, as my friend Rob would say, bloody brilliant over the last 4 years, I would have to say that the Seahawks, they do have a good number of needs and a good number of positions that they need to fortify in this draft. And with that being said, I think it's time to switch over to the Seahawks 3000 NFL mock draft Twitter bag for some questions that we reached out to the Twitter sphere to get some questions to help us sort of fill out this episode in the absence of Rob Rang due to our own technical follies. So with that being said, I want to switch over to this, some questions. And the first one comes to us from Chris Holler at CT Holler1, and he says, how would either of you feel about Kenyon Drake as a third down back? When would be good value for him? And Rob, in your 7-round mock, you talk about Tyler Ervin, running back out of San Jose State, and the way that you talk about Ervin, this is your last sentence of your write-up on Tyler Ervin. He might be the guy they feel they can't leave the draft without. So talk a little bit about Kenyon Drake and talk about Tyler Ervin.
Okay, so to answer the question on Kenyon Drake, I like Kenyon Drake. He's bigger than Tyler Ervin, but I do think that Kenyon Drake he's more, if this makes sense, he's more one-dimensional than Tyler Ervin. He basically is a pass-catching running back. I don't think he's anybody that you would bring in and sort of say, okay, Thomas Rawls has picked up, let's just say he's got a bruised rib or something and he's going to miss a couple of weeks. Let's hand the ball to Kenyon Drake 20 times. And people might be surprised, but Tyler Ervin, all 5'10", 192 pounds of him, is capable of doing that. I genuinely believe the more I've watched of Tyler Ervin, he can run through the tackles, man. I mean, he is a really, really physical, gritty 5'10", 192 pounds. And do you know who he reminded me of while I was watching him run? He reminded me he plays with the same intensity as Percy Harvin. And I thought, hey, how does he compare? And before I even had to look for the comparison to Percy Harvin, someone in the comment section of Seahawks Draft Blog had actually listed their comparable height, weight, speed, combine performance. And do you know, Kenny, that Tyler Ervin is almost identical in size and athleticism to Percy Harvin, and in some cases is even better than Percy Harvin. And I just thought it just makes perfect sense. Here is a guy who is undersized but plays big, just like Percy Harvin. He will run up the gut and he will push the pile 3 or 4 yards, even though he's small. He carried his team on his back for the whole year, got 1,600 yards at 192 pounds. He didn't do that running on the outside. He ran down the damn offensive line and got behind them, gets to the second level, glides and turns like what is a 4 or 5 yard gain into a 10-yard gain. One of the problems with Devontae Booker at Utah is that he regularly does that in college and gets 8 yards, on some carries. And when you watch him run, you think, yeah, do you know what? Some of these 8-yard carries are going to be 3-yard carries in the NFL because he's not got the speed when he gets to that second level to break them off. He's going to find the gap. He's going to do well, jink past make a nice cut or something, get into the space, but then he's going to get brought down because he hasn't got the change of gears. Tyler Ervin is already there, before you've got a chance to tackle him. He's going to have some really nice production in the NFL. And you can use him creatively like Percy Harvin. So he's not just a running back. You can have him doing end arounds. You can have him split out wide. I think on third down, he's going to offer a really good passing option. He's going to be a nice check down option as well for Russell Wilson. I've just got this feeling. I know, by the way, we're talking about Percy Harvin. Tyler Ervin is a captain at San Jose State, and he talks, he speaks almost a little bit like Russell Wilson. So, there's not going to be any character issues there whatsoever. Tyler Ervin is one of the most underrated players in this draft class. And people are sending me messages, Kenny, on the blog saying, yeah, it seems a bit early for Tyler Ervin. And that's because a lot of people are grading him in the 6th round or later than that because of his size. Go and watch this guy play. Go and watch him play against Auburn. You can find the game on YouTube. Go and watch him play an SEC defense and just run the show. I mean, the guy can play, and I've just got a feeling that the Seahawks are going to love this guy, that they're going to take him a lot earlier than people think. I can honestly say if they took him in round 2, you would see no complaints from me whatsoever. So sorry to sort of go on about him rather than Kenyon Drake. But Kenyon Drake, to me, just looks like a pass-catching running back. Tyler Irvin's a pass-catching running back who could lead this running attack, I think, if needs be.
Yeah, it's I'm trying to think. Can I think of a guy who was drafted in the 3rd round by the Seahawks that was supremely athletic, that nobody was really talking about for most of the months leading up to the draft, that turned out to be amazing in his first year, that probably almost instantly we knew should have probably gone into the 1st round, mid-second at latest, and is also named Tyler. And I think I can think of one guy that fits all those needs.
It's funny because I actually said on the blog yesterday that Tyler Irvin is basically Tyler Lockett at the running back position. And just one other note on this, Kenny. The player that I think he compares to a lot as a running back is Brian Westbrook. You remember him? He used to run for the Eagles.
Yeah.
And I had a look at Brian Westbrook. So Brian Westbrook was about 8 pounds heavier than Tyler Irvin, but was still, a smaller back. Brian Westbrook was the 91st overall pick, I think, in 2004. The Seahawks pick that I have Tyler Irvin going at is number 90 overall. And I'd not even thought of that before, I looked at that. So, people are wondering how early Tyler Irvin could go. Well, Brian Westbrook went in that range and had a fantastic career. So I think that Tyler Irvin could be another Brian Westbrook.
I'm looking forward to it now. I mean, I've definitely got my eye on Tyler Irvin and excited to see where he sort of goes. And the Seahawks do not have any proclivities to drafting players several rounds ahead of where everyone else, quote unquote, thinks they should do. Because I would imagine that, once any sort of momentum might build around the Seahawks, you don't think that a guy like Scott McLaughlin is paying attention. You don't think that some of these other GMs out there don't realize that the Seahawks sort of know what they're doing and that they're not sort of starting to target the same types of players. There's the same thing. If the Seahawks are on them, then they're going to feel that other teams are on them too, and they're not afraid to go for a guy that's projected to go in the 5th round. They're not afraid to go in the 2nd round for a guy, as well as some other teams too. And that's the other thing is that you don't know the dangers. If you really wanted a guy, if you really wanted a Russell Wilson, are you going to wait and see if you can get him down for 1 round later? The differences between a 2nd round pick and a 3rd round pick are so freaking minimal that if you don't really think that the value is that you're going to lose out on something by taking a guy in the 3rd round. If you don't, you could say, "Oh, I want to make sure I have the right draft value." No, you want to make sure that you have the best players. And if you think that a guy is your best player, look at the amount of value that Tyler Lockett added to this team last year. And you wanted to say that you want to get the guys that you want to get. And I don't know how many times, and I think that John Schneider and Pete Carroll can be very proud of themselves for getting Russell Wilson in the 3rd round and Bobby Wagner in the 2nd round. But at the end of the day, if they would have missed out on Russell Wilson because he went in the early 3rd round, because there was not a Bobby Wagner, there's not a player that you would have rather had than Russell Wilson in that draft. So you don't want to kick yourself over the decisions that you don't make simply because you want to get a guy closer to the quote unquote draft value that he has. Moving on to the next question. How would Stephen Weatherly fit into the Seahawks defense, and what would be a reasonable projection for him, coming from at Typical News NEUZ? Rob, I don't know much about Stephen Weatherly. Tell me what you know.
Stephen Weatherly is he played outside linebacker, I think, for Vanderbilt. And when you watch him play, there's his tape's pretty average. So there's he flashes in some occasions, and then others he just looks like he's kind of plodding along there. The one thing for him is that while he played outside linebacker, he actually tested very well at the combine. So he tested as if he was an edge rusher as opposed to a pure outside linebacker. So to sort of run through his stats, he's 6'4", 267, 34.5 inch arms. So that, size, perfect edge rusher. He ran a 1.59 split. Anything in the 1.5s is considered very good. So he ticked that box. So athletically, he's pretty good. I just think that when you watch him on tape, he just does not look suited to playing linebacker. That said, if you truly believe in the physical potential that he has to be an edge rusher, then someone's going to take him maybe as a project for that. I think that he is better suited in a 4-3 scheme playing off the edge, and he's got the burst and he's got the length to make that work. So how would he fit for the Seahawks? Probably in a similar role to some of the edge rushers they already have. If Frank Clark's going to be a bit lighter, I think he probably plays that role as well. That might not be the type of player the Seahawks are looking for, but he has got a good character, and he could be a player that they look at, but he's purely a defensive end in Seattle's scheme. He's not going to play outside linebacker like he did for his team in college.
Little rapid fire at 116 Beast, and I'll just give the first part of this. Why aren't more people talking about Kyler Fackrell? And I'll just leave it at that.
I don't know, because Kyler Fackrell's a pretty good player, and he's a splash play specialist. So I think he only had 4.5 sacks in 2015. But when you actually watch the tape, he lives in the backfield. He's a very good pass rusher. He's decent enough in coverage. I think that the Seahawks could show some interest there. In my mock today with a 7-rounder, I suggested that he could be an alternative 2nd-round pick to Kafusi. And the reason for that is that they recently spoke to Shea McClellan, who before he signed with New England, and Fackrell is pretty much, he's a very similar player to McClellan. Could play a bit of linebacker, but in Seattle's scheme is probably better as an edge rusher. So he's somebody they could look at. He's very light. He's got more of a linebacker build. But he makes plays, and that is one of the things they've talked about getting, is somebody who can make plays and make things happen on the defense. And that is what Kyler Fackrell did at Utah State, and a very underrated impact player.
Fans tend to glom on to former first-round picks that do nothing in the NFL. That being said, I think a lot of people are excited to see what Stanley Jean-Baptiste, an early 2nd-round pick, can do with the Seahawks. Maybe sometimes it's just not a right fit. And I don't know that Bjorn Werner was ever a good fit for the Indianapolis Colts, though. He had opportunities, probably different schemes, different positions, and it just never worked out to the point of getting cut. At Sphinx Hawks says, what do you guys at H Parks _ says, whatever happened to Bjorn Werner? Do you think the Hawks will check them out? We don't know about checking him out, but what do you think did happen to Bjorn Werner?
I just don't think he had the heart for it. He's from Europe, so I was rooting for him, even though he's a German and he's not British. But I was certainly hoping for him to have a good career. It would have been a nice story. His tape at Florida State was pretty good most of the time, and he did have some big games for them. But as soon as he got to Indianapolis, he just played so soft. And, it became pretty evident early in his NFL career that this just wasn't going to work. And, it's no surprise that he's been cut and nobody's taken a sniff there. This is one of the reasons why the Seahawks spend a lot of time focusing on guys that they believe love the game. And the psychological aspect of it. They're looking for grit. They're looking for players who are desperate to succeed. And I don't think there are teams out there that do that enough. I mean, the Colts, in the space of 1 year, drafted Bjorn Werner and traded for Trent Richardson, 2 of the guys who've been the biggest busts in the last sort of 5 years because of a lack of heart. So maybe the Colts could learn something from the way the Seahawks sort of judge their guys' personality and their desire and their passion for the game, because that is very lacking in Bjorn Werner. I would make a considerable sort of prediction that he will not end up on the Seahawks roster.
Giving us at Sphinxy Hawk the question that he did have, what do you think of Mike Thomas, the wide receiver at Southern Miss? Rob, this is a guy that, is not getting as much pub as the other wide receivers, some of whom may be named Mike Thomas. But Southern Miss, is he a viable day 3 option?
He is, and I like him. When you watch him play, he makes difficult catches. He's very route running is perfectly acceptable. There's evidence of good blocking as well. So, he ticks all of those boxes for the Seahawks. I do think there are times that he makes life harder for himself. His tracking of the ball in the air isn't that great. So he gets his body into weird positions, but then sort of recovers to make a very difficult catch. So, in that regard, can he make life a bit easier for himself? Can he be a bit smoother with some of those routes when he does sort of contort his body a bit and then have to go up and make a really difficult looking catch? But he's the type of guy that you find in most drafts, as sort of this unheralded smaller school guy. I do think he's probably best suited on an offense that is high production. I think the Seahawks generally, it's hard to sort of predict what kind of receiver they look for, but I think in recent years they've kind of gone towards suddenness. And I think they believe that Russell Wilson needs guys who can get open. He was a bit uncomfortable throwing to Jimmy Graham when he was in blanket coverage and had to learn to trust that. And then obviously Jimmy Graham got injured just as they were getting that connection together. But he seems to excel at throwing to guys who will make themselves very obviously open. And I think that sort of lends itself to Wilson's conservative nature and to Pete Carroll's ball control offense. So, whether Thomas is that kind of sudden athlete, I'm not quite sure that he is. And I do actually think if they're going to draft a receiver this year, Kenny, it's going to be the type of player they don't have on the roster anymore. With Ricardo Lockett having gone, with Chris Matthews having gone, I think if they're going to bring anybody onto this roster, it's going to be a bigger target, bigger than Mike Thomas anyway.
We'll take one more question for the show today and then call it, sorry to anyone who didn't get their question in. We'll do it again next time and try and address some of these topics. And I think some of the questions that didn't get answered, I think we did address them, or Rob has addressed them quite a bit, maybe on his blog. So check out SeahawksDraftBlog.com. It's funny, if you count Spencer Ware as a fullback, which I guess, it's supposed to be what he is, the Seahawks have drafted more fullbacks than they have quarterbacks, along with Kiro Small. Chris Axion asks that if with Coleman and Tukuafu as free agents at the moment, it seems like the sense that the Hawks could go after a fullback. He's asked specifically about Dan Vitale. So what are your thoughts on the Seahawks going after a fullback, and what about Dan Vitale specifically?
I think that Dan Vitale is a better athlete than a football player. When you actually watch him play, I don't think his blocking is particularly anything great. They kind of move him around a little bit and try to get him involved in the passing game. And it's nice that, you get this guy, he goes to the combine, he's a fullback, and he performs athletically and he gets a lot more attention. I don't think he's anything special at all. I don't think that he's a player that, necessarily comes in and lends itself to the Seahawks' physical running style. Now, they have taken fullbacks, and they value the position clearly. But I just feel like it's not going to be a guy necessarily with great athleticism like Vitale. It's maybe going to be, it could be a convert. I don't remember the guy's name, but I think they spoke to a linebacker this week at his pro day and suggested, would he be willing to play fullback? I think they're going to look for sort of big athletes who can maybe play tough, play physical, that they can adapt to this role. I know that's what they tried to do with Coleman, obviously, a former running back, and it could be another running back that they take and then try and work into that role. But I don't think if they do draft a fullback or if they take one in undrafted free agency and get them signed up, I think it's probably going to be somebody we don't really know the name of and it can't really project at this point. I do think, for what it's worth, that they will probably bring back Will Tukuafu. I mean, he's done nothing wrong for 2 years. Apart from, I think, the mistake against the Rams in Week 16. So, and Carroll seems to like that guy. So, if I was a betting man, I would probably suggest that Tukuafu is probably the guy that will come back, maybe with an undrafted free agent.
And I mean, speaking quickly on running backs in the running game, the Seahawks are the best running team in the NFL, really since their acquisition of Marshawn Lynch, and that's going to be a huge transition for them, just going from Marshawn Lynch to Thomas Rawls. It's something that they did pretty much mid-season last year, but they're going to do Thomas Rawls, Christian Michael. Maybe they'll draft somebody, bring in a guy, that kind of stuff. But today, the NFL completely outlawed, made it illegal to do the chop block, which was already illegal up until for passing, but for pass plays and kicking plays. But now they've taken it out on running plays. It seems like they're trying to change as much as possible to go away from the run or make it more difficult to run. I know that Alex Mack, the Falcons' biggest acquisition, saying that it will make it harder for him to do what he's supposed to do and what the Falcons' style is. What is the Seahawks style? I mean, we don't know necessarily which of the 5 guys are going to be out there, but in terms of the new rule about chop blocks and making it a 15-yard penalty, do you expect this to drastically affect the Seahawks' offensive line?
Well, it can do because, when you stretch these plays out and you get sort of linemen moving across, it's quite an effective way to get a guy down on the turf and you are just tripping them up essentially. You're not, trying to break anybody's leg or anything. But I mean, my own personal point of view is I think that I agree with the changing of this. It just seems a bit, I don't know. It seems, I know it's football and the way that the game's going, it's becoming less and less physical, but it just seemed like a bit of a cheap play and a bit unfair on these defensive linemen who are going all out, at full pelt to try and get to a quarterback, and then they're being tripped up, and that is very dangerous. And I kind of agree with this. I think that if there's one thing that I would say sort of to counter sort of what this news, Kenny, is that what I want to see is by all means get rid of the cut block, the chop block, whatever else involves taking out somebody's legs. But let's just see the game in the trenches called properly. So the amount of uncalled holds that you see week to week is incredible for me. And the Seahawks seem to be seem to be punished by this more than any other team. I mean, and you've got defensive linemen who are being held, and you're sort of screaming, "There's a hold." And look, as much as I'm a Seahawks fan, I am not one of those Seahawks fans who thinks that every refereeing decision goes against them or that they should have every call. But I'm very frustrated watching how fewer holding calls get called against the Seahawks in their favor. I think it's ridiculous that they've been the least penalized team in the league for, 3 years now. And the other thing is that one of the complaints that offensive linemen have about this is that they get held as well. And I think the chop block is a good counter for that. That is sort of my understanding with it. Well, just call the hold against the defensive lineman. If the defensive lineman's just grabbing, in a double team, it's just basically hugging the guy and stopping him blocking anything, then the refs have got to go in there and call it. And I just don't think the refs do a good enough job calling the holds. There are so many bogus ones that get called, and there are so many ones that get missed. Do a better job of calling those, and we don't need to see any offensive linemen going for the legs and trying to chop or cut block anybody.
All right, I will chop block Rob out of this podcast. This week's episode of 3000 NFL Mock Draft. Make sure to go to SeahawksDraftBlog.com and follow Rob on Twitter at Rob Staten with an O. Myself, Kenneth Arthur S., if you please. See fieldgoals.com. Subscribe on iTunes. Donate to Patreon. Our apologies to Rob Rang and to the fans out there that didn't get to hear Rob's very nice words about that he was giving the spitting information. You can follow him on Twitter. He's not just, the CBS Sports NFL guru, not named Pete Prisco. He's also a Seattle native. He follows the Seahawks for a very long time, and he specifically knows what they're doing in the scouting area. And it's unfortunate that it didn't work out today, but we want to thank Rob for his time, and we'll get him on again to do it again. So that's it for this week on 3000 NFL Mock Draft. Until next time, we'll catch you on the next draft.